The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Harrison Hall as Jasmine Williams hurried up the wide marble steps. She clutched her books tightly against her chest, her heart beating fast. This was her third week at Westmore University, and she still couldn't believe she was actually here. Jasmine looked up at the building's grand facade, its aged stones telling stories of generations of scholars who had walked these same paths. Unlike many of them, she hadn't come from money or connections. Growing up in a small town where dreams often stay just that, dreams, she had fought for every opportunity. "Hey, watch it." A tall guy in an expensive-looking sweater bumped into her shoulder as he rushed past. He didn't bother to look back or apologize. Jasmine sighed and continued walking. Little moments like this happened almost daily. Nothing outright hostile, just small reminders that some people didn't expect to see someone who looked like her in these hallowed halls. Inside the mathematics department, the hallways buzzed with activity. Groups of students huddled together, comparing notes and discussing last night's impossible problem set. Jasmine walked past them, noticing how conversations sometimes paused briefly as she passed by. 3 weeks in, and she still hadn't found her people. "Did you finish Richardson's assignment?" She overheard a girl with a messy bun ask her friend. "Barely. I was up until 3 a.m. That man is trying to kill us all, I swear." Professor Richardson, just the name made Jasmine's stomach tighten. His advanced theoretical mathematics course was infamous. People said he'd been teaching the same way for 20 years, brutal, unforgiving, and with impossibly high standards. Some students called him the executioner behind his back because of how many academic careers had ended in his classroom. Jasmine found a quiet bench in the corner of the common area and opened her notebook. The pages were filled with her neat, precise handwriting, equations, proofs, and notes from hours of extra study. Math had always been her safe place. Numbers didn't count what you looked like or where you came from. They either worked or they didn't. She remembered her mom's words the day she'd received her scholarship letter. "Baby, you're going to walk into rooms where they've already decided who you are before you open your mouth. Your job isn't to change their minds. Your job is to be so good they can't ignore you." Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate Pryor. "Good luck with Richardson today. Remember, he's just a man with a fancy title and bad breath." Jasmine smiled. Pryor was one of the few bright spots in her new life here. An engineering student with a wicked sense of humor, she had welcomed Jasmine without reservation. The warning bell rang, signaling 5 minutes until class. Jasmine gathered her things and headed toward room 237. Her footsteps echoed in the high-ceilinged hallway as other students streamed in the same direction, their faces tense. Outside the classroom, a small crowd had gathered. They spoke in hushed tones, trading rumors about today's lecture. "I heard he's going to call on people randomly. My brother had him 3 years ago. Said he made a girl cry during the first week. Just don't make eye contact. He's like a predator. He can sense fear." Jasmine took a deep breath and slipped into the room, choosing a seat near the back. She watched as the classroom filled, noting how the front row remained empty until the very last minute. No one wanted to be in Professor Richardson's direct line of sight. The classroom itself was old-fashioned. A semicircle of wooden desks facing a large chalkboard that covered the entire front wall. No smart screens or projectors here. Richardson was known for his disdain for technology in the classroom. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., the side door opened. The room fell silent immediately as Professor James Richardson walked in, his leather briefcase worn at the edges from decades of use. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made his eyes look larger than they were. Without greeting the class, he set his briefcase on the desk and began writing on the board, his chalk making sharp, decisive strokes. Jasmine opened her notebook to a fresh page and steadied her hand. The equation taking shape on the board was complex, but she recognized the framework. She could do this. She belonged here. She just needed to prove it, to herself, and maybe someday to him. Professor Richardson didn't waste time with introductions or pleasantries. He began writing complex equations across the board, his chalk squeaking against the surface as the classroom remained deadly quiet. Jasmine's pen moved quickly across her notebook, copying everything. Mathematics, Professor Richardson finally spoke, his voice sharper than Jasmine had expected. Is not a democracy. It doesn't care about your feelings or your struggles. He turned to face the room, scanning the faces of his students. It doesn't reward effort, only correctness. His eyes, magnified by his glasses, seemed to see through everyone. Jasmine noticed how students around her shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One boy near the front was already sweating visibly. I've been teaching this course for 27 years, Richardson continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. And I can usually tell within the first 2 weeks who belongs here and who's wasting my time. He paused, letting the words sink in. Last year, 14 students started this course. 5 finished it, 3 passed. A girl 2 rows ahead of Jasmine let out a small, involuntary gasp. If you're looking for encouraging words and gold stars for participation, I suggest you find another department. Perhaps literature or... He gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Communications. Jasmine gripped her pen tighter. She'd heard about professors like this. The ones who thought teaching meant intimidation. Her former mentor back home had warned her. Some of them think breaking students is part of the education. Professor Richardson returned to the board and pointed to the equation he'd written. This is where we begin. Can anyone tell me why this approach fails when applied to nonlinear systems? The silence that followed was painful. Students looked down at their notes, suddenly fascinated by their own handwriting. Jasmine knew the answer. She'd read ahead, but something held her back from raising her hand. No one? Richardson's voice dripped with disappointment but not surprise. Then allow me to enlighten you. For the next 40 minutes, he lectured without pause, his explanations brilliant but delivered with a coldness that made the material even more difficult to grasp. Twice he called on students randomly, watching them stumble through partial answers before cutting them off with a curt insufficient. Halfway through the class, a lanky student named Thomas attempted to answer one of Richardson's questions. His response was thoughtful but contained a minor error. And this, Richardson interrupted, is why precision matters. You've just destroyed the entire proof with that careless mistake. He turned to address the whole class. Your future employers or research partners won't care about your almost correct answers. In this field, almost correct means completely wrong. Thomas's face flushed red as he sank lower in his seat. When the bell finally rang, nobody moved immediately, as if seeking permission to leave. Richardson gathered his notes and said, read chapters 3 through 5 before Wednesday. Be prepared to discuss the theorems in detail. Without another word, he walked out. As students hurriedly packed their bags, the room filled with nervous chatter. That was worse than I expected, a guy in a blue hoodie said, shaking his head. My brother warned me, but I thought he was exaggerating, replied his friend. The man's a nightmare. Jasmine packed her things slowly, listening to the conversations around her. A small group had formed near the door. I heard he made a student transfer schools last year. A girl with braided hair whispered. Apparently, he told her in front of everyone that she'd be better suited for a community college. Did you see how he went after Thomas? Another student added. And Thomas is brilliant. He was top of his class at Berkeley. Jasmine shouldered her backpack and headed for the door. As she walked into the hallway, she noticed a teaching assistant posting something on the department bulletin board. It was a list of study groups for various courses. Beside Richardson's class, only 3 names were signed up. Outside the building, the afternoon sun felt good after the chill of the classroom. Jasmine found a bench under an old oak tree and pulled out her phone. She had a text from her mom. How's it going, baby? Conquering the world of numbers yet? Jasmine smiled but didn't know how to respond. She put her phone away and opened her textbook instead. If Professor Richardson wanted to weed out students he deemed unworthy, she'd have to work twice as hard to prove she belonged. It wasn't fair, but then again, nothing about getting to this point had been fair. The equations on the page blurred slightly as she remembered her high school teacher's words. In rooms where people doubt you, let your work silence them. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine began to read. 3 weeks into the semester, and Jasmine had settled into a routine. She woke up at 5:30 every morning to study before classes, spent her lunch breaks in the library, and stayed up late working through Richardson's impossible problem sets. Dark circles had formed under her eyes, but her work was paying off. She hadn't been called on yet in class, which was both a relief and somehow disappointing. The classroom was unusually full that Wednesday. Rumor had it that Richardson would be covering a topic that always appeared on the midterm exam. Students who normally skipped had dragged themselves in, looking sleep-deprived and anxious. Jasmine slipped into her usual seat in the back row. She liked sitting there. It gave her a view of everyone else, while keeping her somewhat hidden. As she arranged her notebooks, Priya dropped into the seat beside her. "You look terrible," Priya whispered with a smile. "In a cute way, though." Jasmine laughed softly. "Thanks. I was up until 2 a.m. figuring out that last problem." "Did you get it?" "I gave up around midnight." Before Jasmine could answer, the side door swung open, and Professor Richardson walked in. Today he looked particularly stern, his mouth set in a tight line. Without a word, he began writing on the board, a complex differential equation that sprawled across the entire surface. "Today," he announced, turning to face the class, "we address nonlinear differential equations with multiple variables." His voice echoed in the now silent room. "This is where many of you will discover whether you truly understand the foundations we've built, or whether you've been merely going through the motions." He picked up a stack of papers from his desk. "Your last assignments were disappointing." Only 3 students demonstrated even a basic grasp of the concepts. He began passing the papers back, his comments cutting through the tense silence. "Mr. Chen, your approach shows promise, but your execution falls apart in the 3rd step. Ms. Patel, please review the fundamental theorem before attempting problems of this complexity. Mr. Wilson, if this represents your best effort, perhaps a different field of study would better suit your abilities." Each comment landed like a slap. Students received their papers with downcast eyes, quickly flipping them over to hide their grades. Jasmine's heart pounded as Richardson approached her row. He handed Priya her paper with a neutral adequate work, then paused at Jasmine's desk. He placed her assignment down without comment and moved on. Jasmine turned over her paper. A red B+ was marked at the top with a single note, "Shows understanding but lacks elegance." She felt a mix of relief and frustration. She knew her solution was correct, even if it wasn't the most efficient approach. "Now," Richardson continued, returning to the front, "let's examine this equation." He gestured to the sprawling problem on the board. The traditional approach would be to isolate the variables and solve systematically. However, there's a more elegant method. For the next 30 minutes, Richardson walked through a solution so complex that half the class struggled to follow along. Jasmine found herself fascinated despite her dislike for the man. His mind worked in ways that made difficult concepts suddenly appear obvious. "The key insight," Richardson was saying, "is recognizing the pattern within the chaos. Mathematics reveals itself to those who truly understand its language." He paused, scanning the room slowly. Jasmine could feel the tension building. Richardson had that look, the one students have learned to fear. He was about to call on someone. His eyes moved deliberately across the faces, row by row. Some students pretended to write notes, avoiding eye contact. Others froze like rabbits spotting a hawk. His gaze finally landed on the back row, and Jasmine felt her stomach drop. "Ms. Williams," he called out suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "You've been very quiet these past weeks." Every head in the classroom turned toward her. Jasmine sat up straighter, her pen still in her hand. "Since you seem so confident in your note-taking," Richardson continued, a slight edge to his voice, "perhaps you'd like to solve this for the class." He pointed to a new, even more complex equation he had just written in the corner of the board. The silence in the room became heavier. Jasmine could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. This was the moment she had been both dreading and waiting for. Or perhaps, Richardson added with a raised eyebrow, "this level of mathematics is beyond your current capabilities." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't just about mathematics. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jasmine slowly closed her notebook and stood up. "I'll try, Professor," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The classroom fell completely silent as Jasmine made her way to the front. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, some curious, some sympathetic, others almost eager to witness her failure. The walk to the board seemed to take forever. Professor Richardson stood to the side, arms crossed over his chest, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He held out a piece of chalk without a word, his eyebrows slightly raised as if already doubting her ability to even hold it properly. "Thank you," Jasmine said quietly, taking the chalk. It felt small and fragile in her fingers. The equation on the board was complex, a nonlinear differential equation with multiple variables that branched out in a sprawling mess of symbols and numbers. Jasmine took a deep breath and studied it carefully. Behind her, she could hear whispers. "Poor girl," someone murmured. "This is going to be embarrassing," another voice said, not quite soft enough. Professor Richardson cleared his throat loudly. "We're waiting, Ms. Williams. Perhaps you'd like to explain your approach as you go. That is, if you have one." There was a light chuckle from somewhere in the middle rows. Jasmine's hand tightened around the chalk, nearly snapping it. For a moment, she considered walking out, leaving this toxic classroom and this arrogant man behind. But then she thought of her parents, of all the sacrifices they had made for her education. She thought of all the nights she had stayed up studying, all the times she had been underestimated. She raised the chalk to the board and began. The first few strokes were shaky, but as she wrote, her confidence grew. The symbols flowed from her hand almost automatically as she applied a technique she had been developing for months. The whispers behind her had gradually faded away, replaced by a stunned silence. "You're taking quite an unusual approach," Professor Richardson commented after a minute, his voice betraying a hint of surprise. "That's not what I would have done." Jasmine didn't respond. She was deep in concentration, lost in the world of numbers and patterns that had always made sense to her, even when nothing else did. She moved to the right side of the board, continuing her solution, each step leading logically to the next. Someone in the class gasped softly, and she heard the rustle of pages as students flipped through their textbooks, trying to follow what she was doing. "That's not in the textbook," a boy whispered loudly. "I don't recognize this method at all," another replied. Professor Richardson had fallen silent, his arms uncrossing as he leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed behind his glasses. The smile had disappeared from his face, replaced by an expression of growing confusion. Jasmine completed another step, then paused, considering the next move. The equation was revealing itself to her, its patterns becoming clear. She could see the solution now, but there was a shortcut, a more elegant approach than the standard method. She glanced back at Professor Richardson, whose eyes were now fixed on her work, his brow furrowed. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty. Turning back to the board, Jasmine wiped away a section she had just written and started again with a different approach. The chalk moved faster now, more confidently. She was aware of the complete silence behind her, the tension in the room almost physical. After several more minutes, she stepped back, looking at her completed work. The solution was there, clear and undeniable. But she had done more than just solve the equation. She had found a more efficient method, one that revealed additional properties of the system. She placed the chalk carefully on the ledge and turned to face the class. 50 pairs of wide eyes stared back at her. Some students had their mouths slightly open. Others were hurriedly copying her work. Professor Richardson stood frozen, his eyes moving between Jasmine and the board, checking her work step by step. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "This is," he finally began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "This is an unusual approach." He moved closer to the board, examining her solution more carefully. "You've used a substitution method I'm not familiar with." It wasn't quite a question, but his tone had lost its mocking edge. "Yes," Jasmine said simply. Her heart was still racing, but her voice was steady. "It's based on a paper I read about adaptive nonlinear systems." A student in the front row whispered to his neighbor, "Is she correcting Richardson?" Professor Richardson's face tightened. He was clearly not used to being challenged, especially not by a first-year student, and especially not successfully. While the classroom remained in stunned silence, Jasmine's mind flashed back to where her journey had truly begun. Long before university, long before she ever heard of Professor Richardson. She was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while her father, a high school math teacher, graded papers. She'd finished her homework early and was bored. "Daddy, give me something hard to solve," she begged. He'd smiled and written down a problem meant for his 10th grade students. To his amazement, she'd worked through it in under 10 minutes. That was the moment they both realized she had a special gift. Her mother, who taught elementary school, had scrounged every resource they could find, used textbooks, library books, online courses. They couldn't afford fancy math camps or private tutors, but they gave her what they could. When the local community college offered a free mathematics workshop on Saturdays, her father drove her 40 minutes each way, every weekend for 2 years. By 14, she was taking college-level math courses. By 16, she had published her first paper in a small mathematics journal under her initials, J.T. Williams. Her high school counselor had laughed when she'd said she wanted to apply to top universities. Be realistic, he told her. Those schools are looking for exceptional students. I am exceptional, she'd replied quietly. Now, standing in front of Professor Richardson's class, with all those eyes on her, Jasmine felt a strange sense of calm. She'd been underestimated her entire life. This was nothing new. Professor Richardson tapped his finger against his chin, studying the board. This solution method, he said slowly, reminds me of a paper I read recently. A new approach to adaptive systems. His brow furrowed deeper. Published by someone named J.T. Williams, I believe. A murmur ran through the classroom. Jasmine said nothing, watching the realization slowly dawn on his face. You're J.T. Williams? He asked, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. Yes, Jasmine answered simply. I published that paper last year. The whispers in the classroom grew louder. Professor Richardson had actually cited that paper in one of the first lectures, praising its innovative approach. He referred to the author as brilliant and forward-thinking. That's impossible, a male student called out from the middle row. That paper was written by some research fellow at MIT or something. Jasmine turned slightly to face the class. I was 17 when I wrote it. I was still in high school. Another wave of whispers swept through the room. Professor Richardson was still staring at the board, rechecking her work as if searching for mistakes. Why did you publish under your initials? He finally asked, looking directly at her. Jasmine met his eyes. Because I wanted my work to be judged on its merit, not on, she paused, not on preconceptions. The classroom was completely silent now. Some students looked uncomfortable, others impressed. Professor Richardson's face was unreadable. This technique, he said, gesturing to a specific part of her solution, you developed this yourself. Yes, Jasmine replied. Traditional methods become inefficient when dealing with multiple nonlinear variables. I found that restructuring the approach using adaptive substitution makes the solution more elegant. Professor Richardson nodded slowly. For the first time since she'd entered his classroom, he seemed to be truly seeing her. The work is correct, he admitted, his voice carrying a hint of something new, not quite respect, but perhaps the beginning of it. And more than that, it's innovative. Jasmine felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, not completely, but enough to stand a little straighter. May I return to my seat now, Professor? She asked quietly. He nodded, still distracted by her solution on the board. As Jasmine walked back to her desk, she noticed the changed expressions on her classmates' faces. Some looked at her with new respect, others with confusion or disbelief. A few looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Pryor squeezed her arm as she sat down. That was amazing, she whispered. You should see your face right now. What do you mean? Jasmine whispered back. You're glowing. For the rest of the class, Professor Richardson seemed off balance, his usual confident demeanor somewhat shaken. He kept glancing at Jasmine's solution, still on the board, and then at Jasmine herself, as if trying to reconcile what he had assumed with what he now knew. When the bell rang, he called out, Ms. Williams, a word please. As the other students filed out, Jasmine approached his desk, her heart racing once again. Jasmine stood in front of Professor Richardson's desk as the last students filtered out of the classroom. Some lingered at the door, clearly curious about what would happen next, until Richardson shot them a stern look that sent them scurrying away. The room fell quiet. Jasmine could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the distant chatter of students in the hallway. She clutched her notebook tightly, waiting. Professor Richardson removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. For a moment, he looked older, tired even. When he looked up, his expression had changed from the confident, almost arrogant man who had started the class. "Why didn't you say anything?" he finally asked. "About being J.T. Williams." Jasmine shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Would it have mattered? Would you have treated me differently? The question hung in the air between them. They both knew the answer. "You cited my paper in your third lecture," she continued quietly. "You called the author promising and clearly destined for significant contributions to the field. But you never once called on me in class until today, when you expected me to fail." Richardson placed his glasses back on and leaned forward. "I don't play favorites, Ms. Williams. I treat all my students with the same high expectations." "Do you?" Jasmine asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "You called on Thomas twice last week. You've asked Lisa to explain concepts 3 times. You've even asked Ben to work through problems on the board. But me? Today was the first time you even acknowledged my existence, and it wasn't to teach, it was to make an example of me." A flash of something, guilt, perhaps, crossed Richardson's face before he composed himself. "I've been teaching for nearly 30 years, he said stiffly. "I know how to identify which students need to be pushed and which will rise on their own." "And which category did you put me in?" Jasmine asked. "Or did you put me in a completely different category altogether?" Richardson's jaw tightened. He gathered some papers on his desk, straightening them unnecessarily. "Your work today was exceptional," he admitted, changing the subject. "Your approach to the equation showed true insight. The kind of insight I haven't seen in a student for many years." Jasmine remained silent, waiting. "The paper you published," he continued, "I've actually referenced it in my current research. I've been trying to build upon your adaptive substitution method." He looked up at her, a reluctant respect in his eyes. "I had no idea you were an undergraduate student." "I'm not asking for special treatment," Jasmine said. "I'm just asking for the same respect you give everyone else. Judge me on my work, not on your assumptions." Richardson nodded slowly. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a folder. "I'm leading a research project on nonlinear dynamics this summer. We're focusing on applications in climate modeling and prediction algorithms." He hesitated, then continued. "We could use someone with your perspective, if you're interested." Jasmine blinked in surprise. A research position with Richardson was highly coveted, usually reserved for doctoral candidates or exceptional master's students. "Are you offering me a position because I embarrassed you in front of the class?" she asked bluntly. Richardson actually laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle even him. "No, Ms. Williams. I'm offering you a position because you're clearly the most qualified person in this building to work on this particular problem, including myself." He'd held out the folder. "The details are in here. Think about it." Jasmine took the folder, still processing what was happening. "And Ms. Williams," Richardson added as she turned to leave, "I expect your contributions to our next class discussion. No more hiding in the back row." Jasmine nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I'll be prepared, Professor." As she walked out of the classroom, she felt lighter somehow. The folder in her hands represented more than just a research opportunity. It was acknowledgement, validation of everything she had worked for. Outside in the hallway, Prina was waiting, bouncing on her toes with anticipation. "Well, what happened?" "Are you expelled? Did you make him cry? I need details." Jasmine laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in weeks. "No, nothing like that. He offered me a research position." Pryor's jaw dropped. "Are you serious? Richardson never takes undergrads for research." "Apparently he does now," Jasmine said, her smile growing wider. As they walked together down the hallway, Jasmine thought about all the times she'd been underestimated, all the obstacles she'd faced. This wasn't the end of those challenges, not by a long shot. But something had shifted today. A door had opened, and she was ready to walk through it. 3 weeks later, Jasmine walked into Professor Richardson's classroom with her head held high. Instead of slipping into her usual seat at the back, she chose a spot in the second row. A few students nodded at her as she passed. Others smiled. Word had spread quickly about what had happened that day, growing with each retelling until the story had taken on an almost mythical quality. The atmosphere in the class had shifted subtly but significantly. Richardson still maintained his demanding standards, but something in his approach had changed. He called on students more evenly now, and while he remained tough on errors, his criticisms focused on the work rather than the person. Today, he announced as he entered the room, we'll be examining a new framework for understanding chaos theory in practical applications. He glanced at Jasmine briefly, and I've invited a guest to help present some recent research findings. The door opened and a distinguished-looking woman in her 60s entered. Several students straightened up immediately, recognizing her. For those who don't know, Richardson continued, this is Dr. Vivian Chen, head of the Applied Mathematics Department and recent recipient of the National Science Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award. Whispers rippled through the classroom. Dr. Chen was a legend in the field. Thank you, James, she said with a warm smile. I'm here because I recently read a fascinating paper on adaptive systems that has significant implications for our department's research priorities. She turned toward the class. The author of this paper is apparently sitting in this very room. All eyes turned to Jasmine, who felt her cheeks grow warm. Ms. Williams, Dr. Chen continued, your work on nonlinear systems is truly remarkable. When Professor Richardson brought your most recent paper to my attention, I could hardly believe it came from an undergraduate. Jasmine blinked in surprise. She hadn't known Richardson had shared her work with the department head. After class, as students filed out, many stopped to congratulate Jasmine. A small group of first-year students, all young women of color, approached her tentatively. We heard what happened, one of them said. With Professor Richardson, it's all anyone in the math department is talking about. Oh, Jasmine said, not sure how to respond. It's probably been exaggerated. Maybe, another girl said with a smile. But it still matters. I almost dropped his class the first week because I was so intimidated. But after hearing about you, she shrugged. I decided to stick it out. Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. I'm glad, she managed to say. As the semester progressed, Jasmine found herself becoming a reluctant mentor to several younger students. She started a weekly study group that grew from 5 people to nearly 20. Professor Richardson even provided them with a dedicated classroom for their Sunday sessions. On the last day of the semester, Jasmine stayed behind after class to speak with Richardson about the summer research project. Your proposal is ambitious, he said, reviewing the outline she prepared. But the methodology is sound. Jasmine nodded. I've been working on refining the approach based on Dr. Chen's feedback. Richardson set the papers down and looked at her directly. You know, Ms. Williams, when you first came into my class, I made assumptions about you. Incorrect assumptions. Jasmine stayed quiet, letting him continue. I've been teaching for nearly 3 decades, he said, and I've developed certain patterns of thinking. It's easy to believe you can size up a student immediately, to put them in neat categories. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. I was wrong to do that with you. It's not just about me, Jasmine said quietly. It's about who else you might be overlooking. What other voices aren't being heard because they don't fit your idea of what a mathematician looks like. Richardson nodded slowly. A fair point. One I've been reflecting on considerably. He gathered his papers. The department is revising our approach to first-year courses. Dr. Chen has asked me to lead a committee on making our program more accessible to all students with mathematical talent. He gave a small smile. She's also suggested you might have valuable input. That evening, Jasmine called her parents with the news about her research position and the committee. We always knew you were special, her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. But honey, what makes me proudest isn't your mathematical brain, it's your courage.